Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey-Davis. I am the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, August 6th, and we will hear the presentation, Equity in Policy and Practice. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box found in the GoToWebinar tool panel. For your content questions related to the presentation, again, just type those in that chat box, and we will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. Coming up next is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2021. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today, we are sponsored by the Ohio chapter of APA. So thanks to you all for bringing this session, this group of folks together to report out on this important and timely topic. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our upcoming webcasts. We have one webcast date available left for 2021. So we are almost completely booked. So be sure to head over to our webcast website, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast to register for these and more sessions. And check back often as I get the information I need. I post registration links, so be sure to check back and register. This session has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing. To record those credits, just head over to planning.org, log into your My APA account, and from there you can either search by today's title or the event number, both of which can be found again on our webcast website, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And if you're on social media, head over to Facebook and type in Planning Webcast and we'll pop up. Make sure you like us. That's where I post any important and timely information like date or time changes. I also post when we have new sessions available for you to register for, so be sure to like us. And we record all of our sessions, including today's, and we post them up on our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast again on YouTube and we'll pop up along with our well over 350 recordings for you to view at any time for free. So be sure to head over there and subscribe so you get notified when new sessions, recordings have been added. That is the end of my housekeeping items. Again, make sure you type those questions in the chat box as you think of them, and we will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. And if your question is for a particular panelist, it would help me out if you stated their name within the question as well, if you want someone in particular to answer it. All right, so with that, I am going to turn things over. Let's see here. There we go. Susan Wood, take it away.
All right. Well, happy Friday, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. What we're here today to talk about is the Planning for Equity Policy Guide that APA approved back in 2019, but really probably more important than that, we're here to talk about an implementation of the guide and equity policies that are included in the guide. And this is the Charlotte Future 2040 Comprehensive Plan, which is an amazing effort and one that you'll be glad to hear about today. I'm here because I'm a member of the Legislative and Policy Committee for APA, and I was privileged to co-chair the Planning for Equity Policy Guide effort, along with Lynn Ross, and with work from about 30 other volunteers that were essential in doing that work. Our panelists today include Jay Rankins, who is with MIG. He's a planning and design leader with over 16 years of national experience in comprehensive planning, downtowns, transit-oriented development, neighborhoods, and urban design. He also was the consultant project manager for the Charlotte Future 2040 Comprehensive Plan. We also have with us Leanne King, who's the director in Clarion's Chapel Hill office and leads the East Coast planning practice. She's worked with local governments for more than 20 years to develop sustainable community plans, comprehensive plans, affordable housing studies, and so much more. We were scheduled to have Alicia Osborne with us today as well. She's the project manager with the city of Charlotte, North Carolina. Charlotte is a 20-year practitioner in the public and private sector, and she, again, was the project manager with the city for the comprehensive plan. We're sorry Alicia couldn't join us, but I have to mention her because of the work that was done, and her work will show through in what's presented today. So before we get started, I know we have a couple of poll questions that we would like to ask you. So we'll start with, I'll turn it back over to Christine, and we'll start with number one.
Wonderful, thank you. So folks, up on your screen now is the first polling question. Have you incorporated equity into any aspects of your planning program? So go ahead and get those answers in. Some folks have trouble if you're viewing this webcast on a mobile device. Sometimes I find that you are not able to answer. So you can always type your answers in the chat box and I can include those. I'll just give it another moment here. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and close the poll and then show our results. So 67% of you on the line today, yes, you have incorporated equity into aspects of your planning program. 19% said no, we haven't, and 14% are not sure. So let's roll into our next poll here. I'm gonna go ahead and launch that. Okay, so for those of you that answered yes, where have you incorporated equity? In your comp plans, zoning ordinances, specialty plans such as transportation, neighborhood plans, park plans, perhaps you had an equity audit or something other. And just because I'm curious, I'm seeing quite a few others. If you wouldn't mind typing in the chat box how you have incorporated equity into your work, if it's not one of those listed during our Q&A, we can talk about those. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and close this one up and then I'll share those results. Okay, so where have you incorporated equity? 24% comp plans, 5% zoning, 38% specialty plans, 6% in equity audit, and 26% other. So that's where we're at. And I am going to give the controls back now to you.
All right, you guys. Well, I have to say, I think that I really do believe that those are great numbers to see as far as those who are starting to incorporate equity in the work that they're doing through either comprehensive plans or specialty plans or other. I know if we were to go back 3 to 4 to 5 years ago, we probably wouldn't be seeing that. We're all so much more aware than we have been in the past. So before we get started talking about the Planning for Equity Policy Guide, I do want to mention APA's policy guides overall. The Planning for Equity Policy Guide is one of the newer ones, but APA actually has more than 25 of these that have been written and created over probably the last couple of decades. They really are important because they represent APA's official position on planning issues. And they also provide tools for members to use in working with their elected officials or with stakeholders or community members. They really provide a lot of great tools. The Planning for Equity Policy Guide that was adopted in 2019 was the first equity policy guide that APA adopted. Next slide. Next slide. So in beginning the work on the APA Planning for Equity Policy Guide, the question came up, well, what is equity? And of course, equity can be any number of things. So first of all, we had to place this in the realm of, we mean equity in terms of social justice. And even when you go to social justice, there are just a myriad of definitions that are out there. The one that we selected for the policy guide is the one that PolicyLink uses. And this is just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential, unlocking the promise of the nation by unleashing the promise in us all. And really the key here is the word fair. I think if you go to any equity definition regarding social justice, the word fair is there. It's at the heart of it. Next slide. Beyond that, there undoubtedly is a link from planning to equity. When you think in terms of good planning in general, today we think of sustainability as part of good planning. Equity is another aspect of good planning. Most important about equity, is that it really does center on people. It centers on how the work that we do affects people, all people, and how does it affect those people. The work is holistic. Planning is holistic by nature, and this plays in well to what we need to do when we apply an equity lens, which is to look at the effects and the outcomes and the impacts, both positive and negative, of all the work that we do. I know that throughout my career, as I've talked to other planners and I've asked them, what made you interested in planning? Why did you go into planning? Almost all of them have said they want to make a difference, and this is certainly one way to do that. Next slide. So in determining why to have a planning for equity policy guide, it's why is that important? Why is it important to have this? Really, planning for equity matters, and I think that we only have to look around us today to see the disparities that exist. When we started work on the policy guide, I think back in 2016, the disparity certainly existed, but certainly over this past year, it's become even more and more important, and has made the policy guide even more important to use and to implement. Again, we have disparities that exist today in virtually every avenue, in income and health and wealth, and the gap is ever widening. And in order to bridge this gap, we really have to have access to opportunity, and planning is one avenue to create that. We really need all community members in order to create equitable communities. Again, planners and planning tools can really make a difference. We're uniquely positioned in a lot of ways, and that's because we're often the first people that meet with members of the community. So we are the ones who are building that trust. We're the ones who are starting community engagement efforts, and so it puts us in a good spot to start that dialogue and build trust. Planning also has powerful tools. We all know that really zoning, there's probably no more powerful tool than that a planner can use, but there are others as well. Next slide. So what the guide does is, again, really establishes that equity is necessary for good planning, that it's not an extra, it has to be practiced as a hard skill. And it confirms that the principles of equity should be the core of all planning policies. This really is part of the equity lens. And it also makes the case for equity in all policies in that approach by providing the historical context, what roles did planning play in equity in the past, in order to assess and point toward the role that we can play in the future. Next slide. So the policy guide structure, with starting out with a make the case section, essentially, that talks about why planning for equity is important and what the role of planners are in advancing equitable communities. Then it includes a section on cross-cutting issues to be considered no matter what work we're undertaking as planners. And those cross-cutting issues include gentrification, environmental justice, and community engagement. You'll see these themes play out in the discussion of the Charlotte Comprehensive Plan today as well. And then after the cross-cutting issues, there's a section on topical areas, which are specific areas of planning that we often deal with, such as transportation or housing or health, energy, and others. Climate change is another one. And both in the cross-cutting issues and in the topical areas, there are actionable policies for planners to use. Next slide. So some of the desired outcomes are that we all learn, and planners have the tools to go forward and do or take an equity in all policies approach in all the work we do. Again, this is the proverbial equity lens. Also, that there's information included in the guide that can be used to both educate and to influence. And this is from community members, stakeholders, and decision makers, elected officials as well. Also, desired outcomes are that the guide will initiate implementation of principles and policies of equity and start a dialogue that can lead to additional study. And then at the end of the day, the desired outcome is that we'll create more equitable communities. Next slide. So the Planning for Equity Policy Guide sections include a historical context. The 30+ members of our group that worked on the policy guide were very insistent that it was important that planners note the role that planning played in the early to mid 20th century in creating some of the inequities that exist today. I don't think individual planners set out to do that, but that they were placed in a role to have to carry out some of those things. And I'm talking about the redlining that occurred in the last 1940s, 50s into the early 60s, as well as restrictive covenants or exclusive zoning and things of that nature. Planning, unfortunately, and planners have been placed in a position to have those. I guess the pot to have to carry those out. The plus side of that, though, is if those tools are so powerful that they can create negative impacts, those tools can also be used in the future going forward for positive change and positive impacts. The Planning for Equity Policy Guide does include the role and responsibility of planners. It includes the ethical role of planners and talks about the code of ethics, where in the APA Statement of Ethical Principles that addresses social justice. And it's for us to understand that these are more than aspirational, that there's something that we need to follow as planners. Also included in the guide is the need for diversity and inclusion in the planning profession. To build trust with our communities, the more we look like our communities, the more it gives us a leg up and better standing to start to build that trust. Plus, it gives us that perspective that helps us to plan better for our communities. So that's something to work toward, is diversity and inclusion in the profession. Next slide. So, Planning for Equity Policy Guide includes an equity in all policies approach. It's essential to include equity in all facets of planning in order to have inclusive planning. The policy guide, as I've already noted, does include actionable policies, both in the cross-cutting areas I talked about and also in the specific topical areas. So cross-cutting issues that are included, and again, these will be talked about as the Charlotte Plan is talked about, are gentrification, environmental justice, and community engagement and empowerment. Next slide. And these are the topical areas. As you can see, many of us deal with these on an ongoing basis or a daily basis. And so there are specific actionable policies for each of these 8 topical areas that are included in the guide. Next slide. And with that, I will turn it over to Jay Rinkins to get down to the Charlotte Plan.
Great. Thank you so much, Susan. We are going to do a relatively deep dive into the Charlotte Comprehensive Plan, which was adopted on June 21st of this year, after about a 3-year-long process. We were very fortunate that we began this process right around the time that the Planning for Equity Policy Guide was actually published. And so it was a unique opportunity to really, begin to implement, the recommendations and guidance in that document. I'm going to start off talking a little bit about that kind of retrospective look at Charlotte. And this is a photo actually from about 2 years ago, I believe, of Uptown in Charlotte, which is the downtown. That's what they call it there, is Uptown. Super vibrant place. If you measure, the success of Charlotte through the lens of perhaps how many square feet are built, how many new housing units, how many people are moving there, the number of new tech jobs, a lot of these metrics that, kind of contribute to our top 10 list, ranking, America's largest cities. Charlotte fares extremely well. It tends to be in the top 5 in many of those categories that I just mentioned. But from the very beginning of this process, beginning with the RFPs that the city actually crafted and issued, there was this focus on not just thinking about how do we continue with business as usual, but how do we really assess where we want to move going forward. And Alicia actually shared this quote with me specifically about the plan. I, like many others, heard Amanda Gorman's poem at the inauguration. But this idea that, we are so much tied to and informed by our past, and how do we actually use that and leverage that and embrace it in some ways, even when it's really uncomfortable, to do better moving forward. Are we going to get it all right? Probably not, but can we think about as many of those intended and unintended consequences as possible and do the very best job that we can? Yes, absolutely. So Susan had mentioned redlining, extremely prevalent practice in Charlotte, North Carolina, and had different impacts in different areas of the community. In the map here, you can see historically it was called downtown, now uptown. It contributed to a lot of people not having access in certain areas. It contributed to concentrating racial diversity, lower incomes, poverty in certain areas of the community outside of uptown. And also then urban renewal came on the heels of redlining. And a really powerful, impactful statistic that we sort of uncovered early on in the process, which is actually through a study that was done by Harvard, was that they were looking at upward mobility and the potential for upward mobility across the US. And Charlotte ranked, out of the 50 largest cities, Charlotte ranked 50th in terms of upward mobility potential. And so if you are born in poverty in Charlotte in this century, in this decade, there's an 86% chance that you will die in poverty. So very striking, something that we definitely wanted to consider, as well as all the other impacts of policies, that were implemented throughout the years, and those impacts on different communities. This is actually the first ward, which is where the government center is, which was actually one of the most vibrant neighborhoods, African-American neighborhoods in particular, but a larger Hispanic population there too, and became, sort of the City Beautiful movement of Charlotte, with big government buildings, large green areas, and pushed those diverse communities out. And so through all these different looks, Harvard, through our team's efforts, which we'll talk a little bit more about, through the work that the city was doing, UNC Charlotte contributed quite a bit to this body of work, began to identify that there was an arc and wedge pattern. So particularly if you look at the segregation by wealth graph here, I think it shows most distinctly, most distinctly, that you have this wedge, which is basically the uptown area, kind of center city heading south, that tends to have the majority of wealth. It tends to have the least poverty. It tends to have the whitest population, the lowest African-American population, as well as the one of the lowest Hispanic Latino populations across the community. And so those people tended to like business as usual. They tended to like the policies that have been in place, and had felt that they had, however they'd, gotten to renting their homes or buying their homes, their employment status, that they had done things the right way. But when we started to have these broader community conversations, that obviously was not the case. And those sort of thoughts, that approach that we had from the get-go starting back in 2018 was really exacerbated through the events of the last 18 months with the global pandemic, with the Black Lives Matter movement, looking at different impacts that COVID had and how it magnified the inequities in the community that were already so stark. And then looking at political strife, and there was the Republican National Convention was actually supposed to be in Charlotte, and it became a political hot button issue. And so that has sort of trickled down a bit at the state level, at the local level, and the community and its leadership are doing good things, including adopting this plan, but not without some really hard conversations and probably really good conversations, honestly, too. But there is definitely some political turmoil. So our team approach was really to look at equity in all phases and tasks. So I think Susan mentioned equity in all policies. We took that one step further and we said, we want to rethink the planning process. We want to think about how do we, from the very get-go, when we start to look at the data, when we start to map, when we start to interview people and have focus groups and community conversations, set the goals, and then look at objectives and strategies and implementation. How are we really going to integrate equity throughout this entire plan? And really, it comes down to measuring what you care about. And so we started out with looking at a three-part kind of phase one package of assessing the situation and really understanding the ins and outs to the greatest extent that we could of what the issues were in Charlotte. And so we had a built city equity atlas, which I shared some of those maps from. So that was really looking at the physical investments in the community, as well as the demographic differences across the community to understand the correlation between the two, think about where do we need to be making new investment, making new policy to address some of those areas that were overlooked for years and years and years. A policy audit report, which I'm going to let Leanne talk about here in a second. And then also a growth factors report, which was really important to the community because they wanted to understand sort of lessons learned from the rest of the country. And so the growth factors report was organized around these peer communities, but again, looked at through the equity lens of, what communities were doing things, maybe in a better way, where could we learn from, but, kind of customized for Charlotte, and where were places that were, they were sort of being gentrified and, displacement was occurring at a rapid rate. And, some of the things that they were doing weren't working, and what could we learn from those experiences? So the equity atlas I mentioned had the arc and wedge. This just really illustrates that here. And we saw that the greatest differences, looking at a lot of different factors, were the vulnerability to displacement, probably, most importantly, but a job skills match. Not only were these individuals having less opportunity overall, but there was fewer job opportunities that matched their skills nearby. And so people, if they did have employment, were having to travel, extraordinary distances to get to those jobs.
Are we doing okay?
Hopefully everyone can hear me again. I apologize.
Oh, yep.
Great, thank you. So this is that distinct pattern. I won't go through all of these, but again, probably the greatest contributors were race, income, education, and job density. The atlas looked further at different aspects. We used neighborhood planning areas, which is a unique thing to Charlotte. They don't have recognized neighborhood boundaries, but they have these neighborhood planning areas. So looking at different ways that the community differed in these different areas and how we needed to address different policy guidance to address those inequities. And as I hand it off to Leanne, one thing that we've talked about was this idea that you can't really know where you're going until you know where you've been. So this was this continued idea, which we didn't just stop at looking at the physical investments in the community, the demographics, but actually we wanted to look at policy as well, to understanding those positive and negative impacts, intended and unintended consequences.
Great, thanks,
Leanne?
Jay. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so for Charlotte Future 2040, looking at where the city had been included a look at the data and trends related to equity and existing policy direction. I'm going to talk about the comprehensive plan policy audit that Jay just mentioned that was prepared for Charlotte. This effort was one of the first steps in laying the groundwork to prepare the new comprehensive plan. And the intent of the policy audit was to create an honest accounting of the city's current policy direction included in myriad plans. The original project manager that we worked with was quite dubious about the value of this effort, which was a very time-intensive and considerable effort for both the consultant team and the staff working on the project. And we're happy to share that the city did not waste its time and money on this evaluation. It really just laid out all of the existing planning policies for the city in an easy to access way. And it was a very good jumping off point to understand where progress needed to be made. Next slide. So we started this process to look at the existing policy direction of the city by identifying the objectives for the policy audit project. And there are 4 in total. The first 2 here included synthesizing community-wide policies for more than 30 citywide area and county plans to create a common understanding of the current policy direction. The second objective was to organize those policies using a community planning topic framework that really leveraged the original organizational structure of the plan, and it had a focus on equity and inclusivity. If you go to the next slide, you'll see a list of a lot of words that we as planners are constantly working to define and understand and create policies and regulations for. We looked at all of these topics when we reviewed these 30+ plans. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see pop out the topics that focused on kind of where the city stood on equity policy. So these were particular areas that we wanted to identify what the city was doing in their current policy direction that really focused very much so on equity. If you go to the next slide, you'll see the final 2 objectives for this policy audit. Number 3 was to rank the policy maturity and identify policy gaps for exploration during the Charlotte Future process. We wanted to find a positive way to express the status of policy direction in the city and focus on a path forward. Everyone loves a house plant, and the idea that we can start something, we can put it to seed and watch it grow. So that was the kind of illustrative way that we identified policies that have been planted but maybe not really grown yet, policies that have taken root, and well-established policies. And our final objective was to capture staff's input on policy effectiveness and the relationship to implementation. We didn't use that directly in the policy audit report, but we came back to it later when we were talking about the policy framework for the plan and thinking about implementation efforts. Okay, next slide. So there were 4 steps in this process. The first was developing that organizational framework for the document and figuring out all the different topics that we were going to be exploring as we reviewed these plans. The second was to actually review them and identify those policies, categorize them, and identify gaps. The third was to apply for the staff to apply an effectiveness rating about how well those policies were being implemented and to confirm gaps. And the fourth was to theme and synthesize these policies and summarize the gaps. So there was a lot of data that was included in this really fun Google spreadsheet that we, there were numerous people working on, and we were, our final task there was really kind of theming all of that information into something that would be useful for the team and the general public to look at. So if you go to the next slide, this is one of our chapters in the policy audit report. I'm going to focus on this here, the inclusive city theme. We looked at the full array of issues identified in the APA Equity and Planning Policy Guide under this topic. The items that are highlighted in green, those bulleted topics there, were planning topics that the city was having active conversations on with the broader community at that time. Keep in mind, this was 2019. It was pre-Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. Since the events of last year, these issues have been front and center for the city, the ones that aren't in green shown here. Next slide. So Susan talked about some of the cross-cutting issues that are identified in the policy guide, and so I'm going to highlight 3 of those here and what we did in terms of the policy audit. So the first one here is gentrification, cross-cutting equity issue of gentrification. And kind of a subtopic of that is looking at neighborhood reinvestment without displacement of people and businesses within that neighborhood. And what we found was that there were 2 area plans and a county-wide plan that touched on this issue. And we have, you see the displacement bullet there in the second box that gives a description of what that policy direction was within those 3 plans. But it also identified a gap for exploration and really building off a study that the city had done in 2012, almost 10 years ago, and kind of building off that and thinking about how that information can be leveraged and updated in new policy direction and indicators created to help measure progress and combat gentrification. Next slide. Focus, this cross-cutting equity issue is environmental justice. When we looked through all of the plans, we did not identify any plans that specifically addressed this topic. And so there was no general direction, policy direction within the city related to environmental justice. So the recommendation of the policy audit is that, you know, these are opportunities for the city to establish environmental justice policies and environmental exposure policies, particularly for vulnerable neighborhoods. And then finally, the next slide, community engagement and empowerment. There were 2 area plans that focused on this particular topic, transparency and accessibility of government, and focusing on civic engagement and communication. And we identified that a gap for exploration during the planning process was how to build safety, trust, and accountability. The City Council had written a letter to the community that talked about these issues. And so the idea was that the comprehensive plan could pick up, you know, with the guidance of that letter and develop some specific policies related to public safety, public trust, and accountability of government operations. Next slide. So there were many policy subtopics that were emerging issues, not only for Charlotte, but for communities across the nation. Inclusivity and equity, while these seem like common words that we hear today, weren't as common just a few years ago. Equitable hiring, reduction of income gaps, among other issues. We really saw that this was an opportunity for Charlotte to set a national standard for addressing these emerging issues and through their plan recommendations. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Susan.
Yeah, thanks, Leanne. Yeah, popping in just to note what you will find in the policy guide regarding the cross-cutting issues that Leanne talked about and how they were addressed in the Charlotte plan. The first one of these is gentrification. Next slide. So really, what the policy guide does is it explains gentrification. And of course, the most negative effect of gentrification is the potential for displacement when underserved neighborhoods are invested in and they're ripe for reinvestment often. Then without planning ahead, displacement can occur. Investments are truly important for communities because if you don't invest in communities, you don't lift them up, you don't provide the same amenities for others in the area. But when those investments are made, they need to benefit all community members. Next slide. All right, so here are some of the policies that are included in the Planning for Equity Policy Guide. One is taking a comprehensive approach to mitigation. And what this means is to look ahead to think about what impacts can occur, and then to be innovative and creative in determining ways to avoid negative impacts such as displacement. Policy 2, conduct a social impact assessment. Again, this is all part of looking at what the demographics are, what the issues are, what the potential for displacement is, so you can plan ahead. And then policy 3 is, again, to encourage equitable development.
Great, thank you, Susan. So thinking about integrating equity from vision through implementation, we talked about the planning process, and now thinking about the plan content. How do we really integrate equity when we can get a good handle on what the issues are? And so we talked about it's not only important to measure historically what has happened as a result of plan policies or the lack of policy in some cases, but we wanted to think about how do we establish a framework for equitable growth moving forward. And so we actually developed 5 key sets of measures. These were kind of key indicators, all including several different measures. So those included vulnerability to displacement, which we, through our exploration of the work, actually made an overlay. So it's almost a crosswalk with each of the 4 others that I'll touch on in just a second. So it was really important to consider the people, those demographic characteristics, household characteristics, neighborhood culture and characteristics when looking at these other 4 areas. So next was access to essential amenities, goods, and services. We actually have a pretty aggressive goal of 10-minute neighborhoods in the plan, and I'll get to that in a second. But we identified with the community what were those essential pieces, not trying to make every community or every neighborhood the same necessarily, but what should every neighborhood have access to? And so that was that first one. The next was access to housing opportunity, which had to do with affordability, it had to do with housing type and diversity, as well as opportunities to rent and to own, and then the distribution throughout the community. Looking at access to employment opportunity, some similar, but on the employment side. There are some very large areas within Charlotte that don't have employment opportunities or only have a handful of service job opportunities. So looking at through the economic development policy, how might we not only support existing businesses and address that really important piece that oftentimes is overlooked, which is business displacement, but also looking at opportunities to create new job opportunities. And then finally, environmental justice. As Leanne said, there was a lack of policy generally throughout Charlotte in working all different departments. They have a really interesting kind of joint city and county governance structure. So working across agencies, working with the transit agency. Environmental justice obviously was being thought about, but there was no explicit direction on how we would address that moving forward. So the vulnerability to displacement index, really key to many of those demographic factors that I mentioned earlier that are indicated with the arc and wedge. When we looked at access to essential amenities, goods, and services, we came up with a list of 7 different key pieces ranging from childcare and access to parks and open space to having access to healthy food and healthcare. And then an interesting one was internet access, as well as opportunities to have access to financial services. Access to housing included housing unit diversity, as I said, the cost, size, subsidized housing was looked at, the level of reinvestment in different areas, on the public side, supporting different neighborhoods, as well as tenure. Access to employment opportunity included job density, employment in the community shed, and then tried to look at a variety of jobs. So looking at wage levels, looking at middle skill jobs and whether or not those were prevalent, as well as knowledge-based jobs. And all of those factors then contributing to this idea of creating complete and equitable communities, realizing that there wasn't a one-size-fits-all solution. So what were the policies that we could put into place to really increase opportunity and increase access without trying to have a cookie-cutter approach to the entire community across Charlotte? So we introduced 10 place types and talked about how there's a lot of different flexibility and variety within these place types, but that they're essential in terms of creating places to work, live, and play, and looking at the distribution of those places across the community to ensure that people have access. And then we had our policy framework, which Leanne was a huge contributor to, as well as Alicia and many of the staff in Charlotte. Revolved around 10 key goals, and I'm going to hit on a few here and just hit a couple highlights. There's a lot of words on the slide. I would encourage you to check out the actual plan, which is online, as well as this presentation will be available to you as well. But I mentioned aggressive 10-minute neighborhood policy. I think a 15-minute neighborhood policy is a little more prevalent, but we ended up being a little more aggressive on that time because we included bikes and transit in that access kind of equation. And so you should be able to walk, bike, or take transit to key amenities, services, and services in your neighborhood within 10 minutes. And so some of the big ideas, and we organized the overall policy framework this way because it ended up being, somewhere between 25 and 35 on average policies per goal, quite a few for a large, complex, city. And so we wanted to make sure that people at a glance really understood what some of the bigger policy ideas included. So this idea of creating a robust network of food co-ops, community gardens, neighborhood-based food sharing, community benefit agreements was a hot topic throughout the conversation and a continued discussion item for Charlotte and frankly the state of North Carolina, what shape those end up taking. But really key to the equity conversation because there are a lot of communities that did not have access to even one of those essential amenities, goods, and services, let alone all of them. Goal 2 is neighborhood diversity and inclusion. We ended up having 2 housing goals in the plan. So one was focused on diversity, the other was focused on affordability. And we acknowledged, right up front, we would acknowledge today, I think Leanne and I could talk about this if people are interested, but, there's obviously overlap, but we thought that it was distinct enough and important enough to create 2 different goals. So this was probably the most controversial topic, to be really honest, throughout what ended up being an 8-month review and adoption process. This idea of allowing more housing types in what are traditionally single-family zones or zoning districts to encourage housing diversity everywhere in our community. So in essence, we were saying single-family, detached-only zoning is exclusionary, and that we wanted to include more opportunities. ADUs had already been introduced into those neighborhoods in places where HOAs did not prohibit them. But we were actually including duplexes and triplexes in the fold as well. And this policy did get included in the final plan, and we're now helping with some assessment on how to implement that effectively. Next was housing access for all. So that second housing piece. I think most notable here is that second big policy idea. Again, this really focusing on affordability and access and not so much the housing mix. So that second bullet is create a robust program of restorative justice targeting home ownership, creation and growth of small business and equity building for the Black community, including strategic application of existing tools. Goal 5 was around safe and equitable mobility, really important to the transportation department, and then working closely with CATS, which is the transit agency in Charlotte, that equity be sort of at the fore here and, really trying to make a strong departure from simply trying to move as many cars as possible and really thinking about the people, and taking a step even further than just, thinking about multimodal. But thinking about the costs associated with different ways to get around, thinking about the land use connection and how we can, coordinate that better, the housing, jobs, balance, so on and so forth. Then goals 8 and goal 10, and we will hit a couple others when we get to environmental justice, but goal 8, goal 10 is diverse and resilient economic opportunity and then fiscally responsible. This idea of actually creating new job centers where none exist today, which is tough in a city that's relatively built out. But it's a really important piece of what the community told us they wanted to see. And so we are helping the community now with a process of mapping those place types and identifying where those new regional activity centers should be with a high priority on the east and west sides of the city. And then finally, fiscally responsible, which had to do with kind of, one of the legs of the stools of sustainability. Thinking about fiscal responsibility and making sure that we weren't, dreaming up this big vision that was not implementable. But where we really came down on the equity side was there's been a lack of investment in many, many areas of the community that are in that arc. So, places that have lower income, higher poverty rates, large Black and Hispanic populations, as well as a growing international population, lower education levels. And we said over half of the public spending, infrastructure spending, over the next 20 years, the life of this plan should be in those most vulnerable communities. And Susan?
Yeah, just to sort of set the stage for the environmental justice conversation, there is a section, a cross-cutting issue in the Planning for Equity Policy Guide on environmental justice. Next slide. And really at the, again, as pointed out earlier, at the heart of environmental, actually, let me start over with that. At the heart of equity is fairness. At the heart of environmental justice is also fairness. So in many ways, the two really overlap and dovetail. In other words, environmental justice is very much a part of equity and of achieving equity. What you see on the screen is the EPA reference to environmental justice, the fair treatment of people of all races, cultures, and incomes. So again, it's a broad statement in many ways. It can be implemented in very specific ways, but environmental justice, like equity, has to do with fairness. Next slide. And these are the policies that are included in the Planning for Equity Policy Guide to deal with that. Policy number 1 is really the win-win, encourage triple bottom line outcomes. This is really referring in many ways to the sustainability stool, which is made up of environment, equity, and economics. If you can achieve all of those, you're a long way toward your goals. Policy two is give deference to local knowledge. This has to do, it overlaps with community engagement in some ways. It has to do with listening to the community, hearing from the community, knowing what's important to them, and also paying attention to the cultural aspects that exist in the community, so you don't override those. This is part of life and part of being fair. Policy 3 is encourage collaborative problem solving, and policy 4 is to organize and support pro bono planning efforts to assist underserved and under-resourced communities with environmental justice concerns or environmental justice communities. Again, though, just circling back, at the heart of environmental justice, just at the heart of equity, is fairness.
Great. So one of our key pieces of the equitable growth framework, is environmental justice. So this is actually one of the areas, and maybe, it has to do with what Leanne talked about with, the lack of existing policy around environmental justice in the city of Charlotte. But it was very difficult to find data that would really help us understand. So this is in each of our equity metrics, we actually identified things that would be great to measure moving forward and would actually tell a fuller story. But this particular topic had our largest list of those kind of, a wish list of data. So we were able to include tree canopy, which is a large concern in the city of Charlotte. They have a very lush tree canopy, and they're losing that percentage of tree canopy pretty quickly with the development that they're seeing. But particularly in those areas that are, underrepresented in our areas of vulnerability to displacement. Impervious surfaces, proximity to heavy industrial uses, proximity to major transportation infrastructure, and floodplain. So we had a couple of goals that really hit on the environmental justice component specifically. So goal 6 was around healthy, safe, and active communities. So really looking at the environmental determinants of health and targeting locations of environmental contaminants through the conscientious mapping of the place types and new zoning districts. The great thing actually about this process, unlike a lot of plans, large comprehensive plans, or even smaller, community comprehensive plans, you do the plan, and then sometimes it's another 3-4 years before the zoning is updated. There's actually a concurrent effort to make sure that there was a big jump start on the creation of a unified development ordinance, updating the zoning, but also a lot of other development standards. And so the place types are going to be linked directly to each of those 10 place types will be linked to specific zoning designations, and then a set of development standards as well as other pieces of the UDO to help encourage environmental justice and better quality development moving forward. And then goal 7 is around integrated natural and built environments. And so the policy highlight here was using the tree conservation fund and ideally creating new sources of funding as well to increase the investment in green space and tree canopy. Again, particularly in those areas that are showing up as being least just when it comes to environmental justice. As we continue to move forward, we wanted to make sure that through all the different metrics, the different policies and goals, that when the rubber hit the road, so to speak, that we were actually kind of putting our money where our mouth was. And so how and where to prioritize those limited resources. We provided very specific guidance in the implementation strategy to use the equity metrics to identify those places and amenity gaps, and then link those to, in that sort of lower half of the left side of the screen, link those to the CIP, to the public-private partnerships, the community benefits agreements that were being discussed, as well as development impact fees, and a variety of other tools. So that's not just, kind of floating there with policy guidance without any way to implement it, but that is actually, we're linking it to all the other departments, the city's process with the city manager, the city council, and that real change will occur sooner than later.
All right, so this is the third cross-cutting issue that's included in the guide, and I know that Jay is going to cover after this, is community engagement and empowerment, and with empowerment being a very important part of that statement. So looking at community engagement and empowerment, public participation and meaningful outreach is needed because all need a voice and we need to listen. And then there is also a need to broaden our outreach strategies to ensure that all people, not just property owners, but renters and those who often don't have power in our communities, also have a voice and a say in the future. Next slide. So these are the policies that are included regarding community engagement. And I should probably state that for all of these are, bullet point policies, but there's additional information included in the guide on each one. So the first policy is institute principles of effective community engagement and utilize targeted strategies. And what this means is things that many of us have probably been trying in our communities over the past, certainly the past year when we've been living in a virtual world. And that's how do we do outreach to everyone? How do we ensure that we have interpreters, for instance, if we have a variety of languages that are spoken in a community? How do we reach all communities? Using multiple virtual platforms even, including cell phones, which most have, though certainly not all. But again, it's using all strategies available to get community members to the table that are targeted to those specific communities so that we really hear the voices. Policy 2 is implement principles of participatory planning. This means listening. Listening to what the community members have to say, not telling them what they need, and then taking their voices back to the decision makers so that they can act on those, or if they're unable to act on those, explain why. And then we need to tell the community why, so that at least there is a feedback loop so that they know their voices are heard and their voices need to be heard. Policy 3, build trust through outreach. Same thing, make sure there's a feedback loop so that voices are heard and listened to and acted upon whenever possible. Jay?
Great, thank you, Susan. And I'd like to say that this is the section that Alicia Osborne from the City of Charlotte was going to present. And I just I'll try to do it justice for everybody. I have been involved in a lot of the pieces here, but the city staff was just, kind of went above and beyond. One of the most robust engagement processes I'd ever seen, and really, led by Alicia and her great team. So 500,000 plus interactions measured through everything from social media to meeting attendance to people who played a game that I'll highlight for you, who came out to different events or participated in virtual events, and really tried to create access to the information. To Susan's point just a second ago, we, about midway through our process, entered the pandemic. And so this idea of, shifting to 100% virtual wasn't going to fly. We had already made a commitment, to engaging all different people across the community, particularly those that we hadn't heard from in previous planning efforts. And so we had to look at how do we make those virtual opportunities as accessible as possible, but how do we still create some sort of high touch companion to the high tech? Looking at input from groups representing all segments of Charlotte, and then engaging people who traditionally have not been in the room. And so we actually created a very targeted list of people of color, youth, non-English speaking residents, and those with lower incomes, and continuously pushed to engage those folks in the process, but really measure everybody who had been in the process. Through the effort, the community was the highest priority, quite honestly, and I believe in my heart, should have been. But I think through the latter kind of phase of the process, that 8-month adoption process, we realized that we could have done a better job of bringing the elected and appointed officials along with us. There were briefings and things like that, but they wanted to be able to roll their sleeves up as well, and have that sort of meaningful engagement, like Susan was talking about, not just listening, but also providing input and seeing that reflected in the product. Staff was very engaged across multiple departments and agencies throughout the entire process, and I applaud them for their consistency and patience with us, and commitment to the process. And then, similar to the elected and appointed officials, I think the media, we leveraged them extremely well beginning when the draft plan was available, but they were playing catch up in what was a very complex document, set of policies, goals, and strategies. And so, we did our best to give them the correct information, the right information, the messaging. But if we could have been a little more proactive about that, I think we would have been successful. But I did want to, overall, those were a few lessons learned, but which we'll hit again at the end in all of our different categories. But overall, it was a super successful effort. The African American community, 35%, of the overall city makeup, and 51% of our participants overall. Looking at some of our other targeted groups, Hispanics and Latinos, maybe not quite as well. We tried a lot of different methods, going to where people are, translation services, even totally different efforts, kind of working with neighborhood leaders to understand, what might be engaging to people or intriguing to them. The senior population, we did a great job on. Youth population was a struggle throughout. We felt like tracking and being really transparent about that tracking was key throughout the process. So we showed that spatially how people were represented throughout the community, but also tried to show, particularly with race, age, income, what type of representation we were getting. So we included these types of infographics and metrics and stats in all of our presentations. This is actually, everything doesn't fit on the slide here, 40 plus ways to connect with Charlotteans. And so we tried to get really creative, leaning into partnerships pretty extensively. And, churches, thinking about people riding the bus, mailers, virtual pieces, social media, leaning on a pretty large ambassador program where we used volunteers in the process. And, they were some of our stakeholder group members, but they actually were given tools to, help get the word out as well and engage folks. That ambassador and strategic advisor program, this is just an example of the third phase of the project. They were with us every step along the way. And I think ultimately throughout the 3-year process, we had nearly 20 meetings with them. And their fingerprints are all over the draft plan that was issued on Halloween of last year and the plan that was ultimately adopted. Getting the word out was key. We realized that, and I'm sure all of you have run into this, you can plan the greatest meeting or online event or where you'll see a couple of fun examples of other kind of things that we did. But if you couldn't get the word out and actually, have people utilize those or show up, it was all for naught. And so really trying to leverage that, being creative and pivoting throughout. We created, I think, a unique aspect of our engagement was that we created a public engagement plan at the very beginning of the process, which was intended to look at the full 3 years. But then on the heels of each phase concluding, we did a public engagement summary and then developed a public engagement strategy for the next phase. And so we were able to actually pivot, and we had enough flexibility in our contract with us and the city staff and their resources that we were actually able to learn from the previous phase and really try to do better in the next phase. Part of that included creating a game. We gamified the planning process. There were actually 2 games. One was a board game called Growing a Better Charlotte. And then there is this card-based city building game. And this is just this stats on the card game, but if you include the board game, we had well over 2,500 participants that engaged in the process through that effort. And when we did some follow-ups, they, about 60% of those said that they only engaged in the process because the game was kind of this fun, unique way, and they probably wouldn't have engaged otherwise. Youth engagement, again, we were struggling a bit, but trying to do better and be creative. We engaged the artist community. Actually, some of those artists that worked on the Black Lives Matter mural that I showed right at the beginning of the presentation helped create these coloring sheets. We had a TikTok challenge that was really targeted at the youth, which Alicia and I had to rely on our younger staff to help out with this. But we ended up having nearly 12,000 or over 12,000 total engagements via the TikTok challenge. And then the plan itself, we created a PDF, kind of regular, desktop published version of the plan, but we also had an e-plan. And then we tried to think of as many ways as possible, not only for people to access the draft plan, but to message that and then also accept input. So you can see at the bottom here, people could submit comments and questions online, through the mail, via email, over the phone. We used the 311, which I know a lot of communities have, which was really effective. We just had to organize with them ahead of time. And it was actually, we were surprised at how many people ended up phoning in with comments. On October 31st, when we unveiled the draft plan, we did a drive-in community workshop. I think still could be an extremely successful event. Maybe it looks and feels a little differently with changing, restrictions and that sort of thing, but it was a great outdoor event. There's a large screen, and people were able to text their comments and questions, and we responded to those from the stage. They were able to tune in Spanish or English on their car radios and hear the presentation as well as the responses to those questions. And then we did a virtual open house, and we made sure that anything that we did virtually, whether it be something as simple as a Zoom meeting, or maybe posting documents to the website, but all the way to this virtual open house platform, that it was mobile accessible. Because to Susan's point, not to say that it's 100% across the board, but a lot of people do have access to the internet, but that percentage goes down dramatically of the people. If you say how many people have access to internet with a desktop computer or a laptop, a lot of people rely on their mobile device. So we created a virtual open house platform, both for the preliminary recommendations as well as the final plan. And then Alicia really spearheaded and spearheaded actually moving forward for implementation pieces, doing these short kind of whiteboard animated videos. This is just a screenshot, but thinking about messaging, and this is probably just the most graphic representation of that, but taking a step back, and these are, again, complex ideas, things that people hadn't maybe thought about explicitly before, and how do we make that, one, accessible to them, but two, something that, captures their attention, because a lot of different things competing for that. So these are Alicia's takeaways from the engagement process. She wanted to highlight that the equitable engagement starts with an inside job. And so the organization needs to be really bought in, and it has to do with being flexible, devoting the right resources, and being really committed to not just having the meetings, but making those engaging, meaningful, and then responding to that input. Establishing engagement platforms, activities that can become tools beyond the plan itself, even. So that was something that I respected a lot. And Alicia's guidance was, we don't want to create something that's just a one-off and is never going to be used again. And so an example is that game or the virtual engagement platform. Those were designed in a way that they have a life beyond the planning process and are actually ways to help educate people about the plan and its recommendations moving forward. Tracking and monitoring all the different activities, which can be a pain in the butt sometimes, but is extremely important. And you can't change what you don't measure. And then embracing innovation to meet people where they are. And Alicia, when she presented this with us previously, really emphasized this idea of, obviously towing the line, but, in some cases it might mean asking for forgiveness when the rules don't quite allow what, we'd like to do or like to try. Leanne?
Yeah, so with regards to thinking about the policy audit, the key takeaways that we would like to convey that it's really important to begin the process with an honest accounting of where the community is starting, and that can really help build faith and trust in the process, particularly in communities that might be having challenges related to that. It's really worth the effort to look comprehensively at a community's established policy direction. What we found was that, there were some gaps that need to be filled, but there was also a lot of good momentum that the city had already built, and we wanted to build upon that in the comprehensive plan. It's also important to identify a positive path forward, especially in areas where the community comes up short in those gap areas. That's really going to start the momentum for change. And I think creating kind of the comprehensive plan really has an opportunity to create a look forward and kind of not just focusing on where the gaps exist, but what are we going to do to actually address those gaps.
And then for me, I would say effectively applying the equity lens has to be something that you address from the very get-go. I've been involved in plans, and they, good plans at the end of the day, but equity emerged from that process. And so by the time, I think everyone knows there's a timeline, there's budgets, all these different things that are constraints to us as planners sometimes. And so if we're not really addressing equity from the get-go, it can be tough to, fully integrate and address in a plan. Thinking about, all these different pieces and goals, objectives, and recommendations, not just as an overarching, cross-cutting theme or goal, but really looking at every aspect. Considering the intended and unintended consequences to the extent possible. That was a lot of the work that we did in developing the implementation strategy. And it's a lot of the work that the community is actually taking on in terms of creating different commissions and boards to do a deeper dive as implementation is occurring and monitor that using those different metrics. And then be prepared for pushback and resistance to change. A lot of people do benefit from business as usual. So educating them, helping them see the bigger picture, and, fairness, I think sometimes is misconstrued as taking from, a certain group of people and giving to another. And we like to think about, this idea that, it's sort of rising tides floats all boats. Susan?
All right, well, I get to summarize with some overall takeaways, and I will say these really apply to any planning process going forward, but they were really truly demonstrated in the work done on the Charlotte plan. Going back to those cross-cutting areas, gentrification, you must be proactive and recognize the potential for risk and for displacement early so you can act. If you're not intentional, it's very hard. It's very hard to catch up. You have to get out ahead of it. Environmental justice, again, it's all about fairness. You have to think about fairness and avoid disproportionate impact. With investments, they need to be equitable investments so that you get equitable results. Community engagement and empowerment, we need to listen, not tell, but listen. And we need to go above and beyond, really check in with our community members, not just say we met the requirements for community engagement. It needs to be meaningful community engagement because building trust is what it's all about. And this is the way to build trust. So in everything we do from a planning perspective with regard to equity, we need to think holistically, think big picture, think of all of the impacts and all who are affected. Use empathy, walk in others' shoes to the extent possible and understand their perspective and how the work that we do and the outcomes of that work can affect them. We need to seek partnerships, and this means both traditional partnerships and non-traditional partnerships. We need to be innovative and open. We really need to break down silos. We have planners and we have equity practitioners, but planners can become equity practitioners, and equity practitioners can use planning tools, and beyond that, we can certainly work together. Next slide. So, moving forward, we have the Planning for Equity Policy Guide, which is a broad approach to equity. It really provides a lot of information over a lot of topical areas. The next guide, though, that we have in the works with the APA Legislative and Policy Committee is inclusive growth and equitable economic development. And this is really sort of honing in on one aspect of equity. And again, that's economic equity and economic development. So the idea is that we address policies that lift up communities and all community members, not just some. And again, it's really important that we have all of our community members fully functioning and engaged and contributing to the community. This is good individually for the community members, but it's also good for the overall community as well. Next slide. And then this slide just provides links to resources. It's a link to the Planning for Equity guide, which is on the APA website, and also information on the guide that's in process, because we would really appreciate any comments and input that you have along the way as we go through this process. Also on the APA website. The last thing there is my contact information. Feel free to contact me anytime. I'd love to talk about this. If I don't know the answer, I'll find those who do. So thanks very much, and I'm going to turn it over to Christine for questions.
Wonderful, thank you. We'll see what we can get through, folks. Feel free to type those questions in. I first want to start out with some of the other results for ways in which the folks that are on the line are implementing equity into their planning practice. And some of the feedback that I received includes regional land use plans, grant programs, policies, practices, and procedures, state park planning, grant programs, again, just applying the equity lens to any rezoning proposals or adoption of plans, and addressing this also in city council staff reports. And for those that are living in the private sector, having the opportunity to bring a strong equity lens to planning and economic development strategies for projects. So that, I think, pretty much sums up all of the additional responses that I received. So that's great. Let's get into a couple questions here. The first one is, longtime residents in older urban neighborhoods may feel overwhelmed by sudden new housing construction or styles of construction or affordable housing, for example. So how do we help them, these long-time residents or folks that have a little bit of this NIMBYism? How do we help them understand the importance of it and get them on board?
I can start. So two things come to mind for me. One, I guess, is broader, and it's something I've been grappling with personally. Is there a magic formula for a neighborhood or a district or a city, and sort of what is good and what is what is the best planning practice? And I think I've always been in the mind, until honestly embarking on this plan and some of the recent conversations over the last 18 months, thinking, well, yeah, mixed use places, walkable centers, and kind of ratcheting down the density away from those places. Like that's obviously what we should be doing. And I guess I would just throw it out there, and I'm not saying that that's not great planning practice, but it may not be the best solution everywhere. So really thinking culturally about, sort of neighborhoods and residents and cultural differences and what may be appropriate in different places. For Charlotte, there is a neighborhood conservation overlay that we set policy up for. It already was in existence, but it adds some teeth to it. And it actually helps community members be part of articulating what is unique about their community. And so it doesn't put a stop to new development, but it ensures context sensitivity in that development. And so I think through that process, people feel more comfortable with development, kind of understanding that it will be coming. They may not be happy with that at the end of the day, but at least there's a community conversation around it before it's happening, and then some tools put in place to help it stay the surrounding community. Leanne, were you going to say something as well?
Yeah, I think it's one of those issues that the fine grain becomes really important, like what's happening particularly in a neighborhood or area. It's great to have community-wide guidance. That's what we do in a comprehensive plan, but you can't just apply that unilaterally across the entire area, those kinds of best practices. And so, it is really important to think about what a particular community's context and conditions are, who lives there, are they renters, are they owners, what are their incomes, what are the types of units there, what's the history of development in that area. I think a lot can be done with education and helping people understand why the change is happening and what the market is, kind of how it's playing out within their community, and helping to educate them so as a neighborhood or area they can help to articulate what it is that they would like to see happen in their community in the future. It could be that some older neighborhoods want to maintain the ability to sell their house for a higher price point, and there's nothing wrong with that. So I think that you just have to kind of understand and give people all the information they need to have to be able to kind of make better decisions and provide better feedback about what should happen, particularly in their particular neighborhood.
If I can just sort of broad brush that for a second, what both of you to me are saying is community engagement and listening. I mean, folks with concerns have that need to have their concerns heard and understood. And it to me, it starts there. And it sounds like both of you, what you've said and your approach definitely takes that tact. It also, I think, is important for people to understand the planning process. For instance, the best place to get in is at the comprehensive plan level to make your comments and your thoughts and your concerns heard. So, again, it all goes back to communication.
Thank you. The Planning for Equity Policy Guide, does it include some kind of framework for performing an equity audit similar to that was done in Charlotte, so that folks can audit their own plans?
The Planning for Equity Policy Guide itself, again, is really broad. It's big, but it's broad, and it covers a lot of territory, and it does not include that kind of framework. There are other tools within APA that may, PAS reports, Planners Advisory Service reports. There have been several that have been done on equity in the last couple of years, and there may well be that guidance in one of the PAS reports. It's worth looking into, and beyond that, I think it's something for me to take back to make sure that we do have something like that because it's needed.
Yeah, I don't want to speak for Leanne, but I think both of us would be happy to chat with folks too, if either or both of us, depending on sort of what angle you'd like to take on the equity assessment, and just share tips and tricks and our methodology.
Thank you. So the Charlotte plan was recently adopted, but what are the plans for ongoing monitoring? Are there plans to see if the goals that you set out regarding equity are really following through?
Yeah, so Leanne was really instrumental in helping to sort of set this. There's two parts of it. The first part, Leanne actually spearheaded, which was establishing objectives for each of those 10 key goals. And so then there is suggested metrics associated with each of those objectives, including the implementation section of the plan. And one of the staff is right now working with partners and UNC Charlotte in particular, because they have a really strong relationship to measure those goals. And there may be some metrics that pivot because of data availability and that sort of thing, but those are being measured. And then the equity atlas, the equitable growth framework, which builds on the equity atlas, is set up, and we actually worked with the staff. So they were part of creating the methodology and mapping that. And that's something that they'll be updating at least annually. And we've actually talked to them about maybe doing it quarterly. So they will be measuring what they care about moving forward.
So how long did the comp plan process take? And so some logistical questions. And how many staff were involved? Did you hire consultants to do any portion of it? Was it all in-house? Give us some details.
Sure. So yeah, admittedly, or to be really frank, Leanne and I are both consultants. Leanne is with Clarion, I'm with MIG. We were brought into the process when an RFP was issued. That was about 3 years ago, from about right now. And so our process was a little under 3 years in total with the consultant, team involvement. Distribution of labor within that 3 years, I'd say it was about 50-50, with us doing a lot more on the analysis and content development side, but in partnership with city staff and county staff, and the city really doing more of the heavy lifting on the engagement, communications, messaging side of things, but a partnership for sure. But I also don't want to sell or sort of fail to mention that the process didn't just start when we were hired as consultants. They had actually done a series of community conversations over the previous year, and worked with UNC Charlotte and others in beginning to identify that need and be able to write an RFP, that sort of pointed us in the right direction in terms of developing a scope and an approach and schedule, that initial community engagement plan that really was already reflecting what the community wanted. So that was, I think, about a year, maybe a year and a half even before that 3 years.
I think we have time for one last really quick question. And this has to do with development and developers, working with developers. Most planners, I would say, at some point are working with them on some type of project. And how do we help educate them to get them on board, to shift their moral compass? I'm sure in the development world, there's talks about equity as well. But how do we help kind of tee up and frame our perspective when we're working with developers?
And do you want to take first crack at that one?
Sure. I think that, some of that comes through the actual comprehensive planning process, but probably more so, I think it takes place as part of the implementation of the plan. So particularly if you're looking at, which City of Charlotte in this example is, making adjustments to ordinances, developers are very interested in what's happening with development regulations, and being able to articulate how changes to the regulations are going to have positive benefits with respect to equity, I think is something that they would be willing to listen to. I think, particularly in a community that is emphasizing the importance and value that equity is, has within that community, I think a lot of developers are actually interested in providing those kinds of benefits to the community. It's really about providing them kind of certainty and clarity about what the expectations are that are really important. Just using nebulous terms is not helpful for developers. They like specifics. And so the more that we can be helpful in defining what it is we mean by equity as it relates to the work that they're doing, I think that the better chance we're going to be able to make some good headway and have good outcomes.
Okay. It's 2:30. We have to wrap up. Thank you, Leanne and Susan and Jay, for joining me today and discussing this topic. And I'm excited to see kind of the next edition roll out regarding the economic development piece of it. I think that's also going to be exciting. And to Alicia, who was unable to join us today, but who was very instrumental in this, thank you. If you end up watching this recording, and to that, don't forget, we are recording this and it will be available on our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast on YouTube and we'll pop up. Don't forget to log those CM credits, and you can download the slide deck of this presentation on our webcast website, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And that is also where you can sign up for all of our upcoming sessions. So thanks again to all of you and for all the great work that you've done on this. And everyone, have a great weekend. We'll talk next time.
Thank you.